Power in England was never held by kings alone. For 400 years, much of it belonged to the Mowbrays. They began as strangers in a conquered land, Norman knights who rode to England on the back of William the Conqueror's ambition and carved out an empire of manors, abbeys, and castles across the rolling hills of Yorkshire and the flat marshes of Lincolnshire. They fought in the Crusades and bled on the fields of France. They helped force a king to seal Magna Carta, and they paid for their defiance with their necks. They rose to become Dukes of Norfolk, the highest rank of English nobility, and fell so hard that their entire bloodline ended with a little girl who died before her 9th birthday. And then, nearly 500 years after she was buried, builders on a London construction site broke through the earth and found her coffin, still sealed, still waiting. Tonight, we tell the whole story of their long rise and quiet fall, slowly and softly, to ease you into sleep. Welcome and rest easy. You've found Sleepy Nobles. If this is your first night with us, consider yourself one of the household now. And if you've sat with us before, it's good to have you back by the fire. So lower the lights, rest your head, and let the cares of the day fall away. Tonight, we quietly open the doors of the House of Mowbray and tell their whole story, their rise, their power, and their place in history, unhurried and gentle to carry you softly into sleep. To understand the Mowbrays, you must first understand the world they were born into, and the violent act of conquest that made their existence possible. The year was 1066, and England, a prosperous, well-governed kingdom that had endured for centuries under its Anglo-Saxon rulers, was about to be torn from its roots and remade by foreigners who spoke a different language, worshipped in a different style, and governed by a code of feudal obligation that the English had never known. On the 14th of October, on a long, gently sloping ridge about 6 miles northwest of the coastal town of Hastings, in Sussex, two armies faced each other across a stretch of open ground. On the high ground stood Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, flanked by his housecarls, the elite warriors who formed his personal bodyguard, and the third, the common fighting men of the shires who had been called up to defend their country. Harold's men had already fought one battle that autumn, defeating a Norwegian invasion force at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire barely 3 weeks earlier, and they had marched the entire length of England to meet this new threat from the south. They were tired, but they were determined. On the lower ground, arrayed beneath the papal banner that Pope Alexander II had granted to bless their invasion, stood Duke William of Normandy and his army of knights, archers, infantry, and adventurers drawn from across northern France. Normans, Bretons, Flemings, and men from as far away as southern Italy. They had crossed the English Channel on a gamble, loading their horses and their weapons onto hundreds of small ships and trusting themselves to the wind and the tide. Everything depended on this single battle. If they lost, there would be no retreat. They were stranded in a hostile land, with the sea at their backs and an angry kingdom before them. Among those Norman ranks, standing not in the mail armour of a knight, but in the vestments of the church, was a man named Geoffrey de Montbray. He was the Bishop of Coutances, a title that placed him at the head of one of the most important dioceses in western Normandy, and he had come to England not merely to pray for victory, but to help achieve it. Geoffrey was no ordinary clergyman. The 11th century church was a very different institution from the one we know today, and many of its bishops were as much warriors and administrators as they were men of prayer. Geoffrey de Montbray was a prime example of this type, a man who could oversee the rebuilding of a cathedral and the planning of a military campaign with equal competence. Geoffrey had already demonstrated his organizational abilities in Normandy, where he had undertaken a remarkable journey to southern Italy to collect funds from the Norman lords who had settled there, the de Hauteville family and their followers, who had carved out kingdoms in Sicily and the Italian south. With the money he raised, Geoffrey rebuilt the great cathedral of Coutances, which was dedicated in 1056, a decade before the invasion of England. He was a builder, a fundraiser, and a man who got things done. At Hastings, Geoffrey played his part. The precise nature of his role in the battle is not entirely clear from the sources. Some accounts place him in a commanding position, helping to coordinate the Norman lines, while others suggest he was more of an advisor and morale builder. What is certain is that he was present, that he survived, and that his contribution was valued by Duke William. The Battle of Hastings was long and brutal. Harold's shield wall, a dense formation of armoured men standing shoulder to shoulder behind their overlapping shields, presenting a wall of wood and steel to the enemy, held firm for most of the day. The Norman cavalry charged uphill again and again, their horses stumbling on the broken ground, their riders hurling javelins and hacking with swords at the unyielding English line. The Norman archers loosed flight after flight of arrows into the sky, hoping to drop them behind the shield wall and strike the men within. And still, the English held. It was only late in the day, after hours of inconclusive fighting, that the battle turned. According to the later chronicles, the Normans employed a feigned retreat, a deliberate withdrawal designed to lure the English out of their strong defensive position. Whether it was a genuine tactic or simply the result of confusion on the battlefield, groups of English warriors broke ranks to pursue the apparently fleeing Normans, and when they did, the Norman cavalry wheeled and cut them down in the open. The shield wall, once broken, could not be reformed. Harold himself was struck down in the final hour of the battle. Tradition says by an arrow to the eye, though the exact manner of his death is debated. And by evening, England had a new master. On Christmas Day, 1066, in the cold stone nave of Westminster Abbey, the great church that Edward the Confessor had built only a year before his death, William the Conqueror was crowned King of England. The ceremony was conducted jointly by Ealdred, the Archbishop of York, and by Geoffrey de Montbray, the Bishop of Coutances. It was a moment of supreme significance, the formal consecration of Norman rule over England, and Geoffrey stood at the very heart of it. In the years that followed the Conquest, William rewarded his most loyal followers with vast grants of English land. The entire structure of English landholding was overturned. The old Anglo-Saxon lords who had fought for Harold or who resisted the new regime were stripped of their estates, and those estates were handed to the Normans who had fought for William or supported his claim. It was the largest transfer of land in English history, and it created a new ruling class overnight. Geoffrey de Montbray received one of the largest and most generous grants of all. According to the Domesday Book, the extraordinary survey of English land that William ordered in 1086, designed to record every manor, every plough team, every mill, and every pig in the kingdom, the Bishop of Coutances held approximately 280 English manors. Each manor was roughly the size of a village or a small parish, with its own fields, pastures, woodlands, tenants, and rents. These manors were scattered across the length and breadth of England, from the green valleys of the southwest to the bleak uplands of Yorkshire, and they made Geoffrey one of the wealthiest and most powerful landlords in the entire kingdom. By any measure, he was one of the 10 richest men in England. But Geoffrey's power was not merely financial. William trusted him with military commands. Not the ecclesiastical duties that one might have expected of a bishop, but the hard, brutal work of suppressing Anglo-Saxon resistance. In 1067, 1069, and 1074, Geoffrey led Norman forces against English rebels, crushing resistance with the ruthless efficiency that characterized the Norman settlement. He was, in the words of one historian, as much a military man as a churchman, and his career tells us a great deal about the kind of world that produced the Mowbray family. Geoffrey de Montbray did not live to see the end of the 11th century. He died in 1093, having spent his last years in Normandy after falling afoul of King William II, William Rufus, the Conqueror's son, during the rebellion of 1088. Geoffrey had sided with Robert Curthose, William the Conqueror's eldest son, in a dispute over the succession, and although he escaped serious punishment, his position in England was compromised. He retreated to his diocese of Coutances and died there, far from the English manners that had made him rich. Geoffrey had no children of his own. He was, after all, a bishop. And his heir was his nephew, the son of his brother Roger. That nephew was Robert de Mowbray, and he was a man who would bring the family name both glory and ruin in almost equal measure. Robert de Mowbray was a man of violent passions and limitless ambition. When his uncle Geoffrey died, Robert inherited the bulk of the bishop's vast English and Norman estates, and he added to them the earldom of Northumbria, one of the most powerful and strategically important earldoms in England, commanding the wild and dangerous borderlands between England and Scotland. The north of England in the late 11th century was a frontier zone, barely pacified, where Norman lords maintained their authority through a combination of castle building, military force, and sheer intimidation. Robert de Mowbray was well suited to this environment. In 1093, Robert achieved his greatest military triumph. He led an English army northward to intercept a Scottish invasion force under King Malcolm III, and, at the Battle of Alnwick, near the great castle that still dominates the Northumberland landscape today, Robert's men ambushed and killed the Scottish king. Malcolm III was struck down in the fighting, and his son Edward was mortally wounded. It was a crushing victory that secured the northern border for a generation and earned Robert enormous prestige and the gratitude of the English crown. But Robert de Mowbray could not leave well enough alone. He was a man who made enemies easily and who trusted his own strength too much. In 1095, just 2 years after his triumph at Alnwick, Robert hatched a conspiracy to overthrow King William Rufus and replace him with Stephen of Aumale, a Norman lord who Robert believed would be more amenable to his interests. The plot was discovered before it could be executed, and William Rufus moved with characteristic speed and brutality. The king marched north with an army and besieged Robert in his great castle at Bamberg. The ancient fortress perched on a volcanic outcrop above the Northumberland coast, commanding views across the North Sea and the flat coastal plain below. Robert held out for a time, but he was eventually captured. Some accounts say he was seized while trying to escape, and he was brought before the king in chains. William Rufus was not merciful. Robert de Mowbray was stripped of his earldom, his lands were confiscated, and he was thrown into prison at Windsor Castle. He would remain there for the rest of his life, approximately 30 years. One of the longest-serving prisoners in English history. He died around 1125, still in captivity, a broken and forgotten man. But the king was not finished. In an act of calculated political engineering, William Rufus forced Robert to divorce his wife, a noblewoman named Matilda de l'Aigle, the daughter of Richard, Lord of l'Aigle, a powerful Norman magnate. Matilda was young, she was well-connected, and she came with valuable lands of her own, including properties in Normandy that the crown was eager to control. By forcing the divorce, the king freed Matilda to remarry, and he ensured that her next husband would be a man of the crown's choosing. That man was Nigel d'Aubigny, and it is with Nigel that the true history of the Mowbray family begins. Nigel d'Aubigny was the younger son of Roger d'Aubigny, a minor Norman lord from the village of Saint-Martin-d'Aubigny in the Cotentin Peninsula, the same part of Normandy that had produced Geoffrey de Montbray. Nigel was, in the language of the time, a new man, a lord of no great birth who had risen to prominence through one quality above all others: absolute, unwavering loyalty to the English crown. Nigel and his brother William were among the most devoted supporters of King Henry III, who had succeeded William Rufus in 1100, and Henry rewarded the d'Aubigny brothers lavishly. William d'Aubigny was made the king's butler, a prestigious household office, and became the ancestor of the Earls of Arundel, one of the great noble houses of medieval England. Nigel received something perhaps even more valuable. He received Matilda de L'Aigle as his bride, along with her imprisoned former husband's Norman lordship of Mowbray, and a vast grant of English lands that had been confiscated from another disloyal baron, Robert de Stuteville, after the Battle of Tinchebrai in 1106. The lands that Henry III granted to Nigel d'Aubigny were enormous. They included the honour of Mowbray, a feudal lordship centred on the castle and town of Thirsk in North Yorkshire, along with manors scattered across Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, and several other counties. The honour of Thirsk alone comprised dozens of manors and knights' fees, and it came with a castle, Thirsk Castle, a motte and bailey fortification that served as the military and administrative centre of the Mowbray lordship. Nigel also held the Isle of Axholme in Lincolnshire, a low-lying marshy peninsula surrounded by the rivers Trent, Don and Idle, which was rich in agricultural land and which would become one of the most important Mowbray strongholds for centuries to come. In a single stroke, Nigel d'Aubigny went from being a landless younger son of a minor Norman family to one of the great lords of northern England. He was a man of enormous influence, one of the most frequent witnesses to the royal charters of Henry III, and he administered royal business across the north of England. He may have held custody of a royal castle in York itself, and he acted as an important local official in the king's service. But Nigel's first marriage, to Matilda de L'Aigle, produced no children. After approximately a decade, the marriage was dissolved. The grounds given were consanguinity, the claim that the couple were too closely related by blood or marriage to remain lawfully wed. But the real reason was almost certainly that the union had simply failed to produce the heir that both Nigel and the king needed. Matilda disappears from the historical record after the divorce, and Nigel turned his attention to finding a new wife. In 1118, Nigel d'Aubigny married for the second time. His new bride was Gundreda de Gournay, the daughter of Gerard de Gournay, a Norman lord of some standing whose family held the castle and lordship of Gournay-en-Bray in Upper Normandy. Gundreda brought with her the Norman castle of Écuchet as her marriage portion, adding to Nigel's already substantial holdings on both sides of the English Channel. And within a year or two of the marriage, Gundreda gave Nigel what Matilda never had: a son. That son was named Roger. He would found one of the most enduring noble dynasties in English history, and his descendants would hold power in England for nearly 4 centuries. Nigel d'Aubigny died on the 21st of November, 1129. Some accounts say that he became a monk shortly before his death, a common practice among medieval lords who wished to secure their spiritual welfare at the last moment. He was buried at the Priory of Bec in Normandy, a renowned centre of learning and devotion, and his infant son Roger, who was perhaps 9 or 10 years old, became a ward of the English crown. The boy's vast inheritance was held in trust by the king, and his mother Gundreda managed the estates on his behalf during the long years of his minority. Gundreda was not merely a passive custodian. She was an active and generous patron of the church, a woman of piety and practical intelligence who used her influence to shape the religious landscape of northern England during a period of extraordinary monastic expansion. She granted lands to the newly founded Cistercian Abbey of Rievaulx, one of the most important religious houses in Yorkshire, and she sheltered monks who had fled from Scottish raids in 1138, providing them with a temporary home before they could establish themselves permanently. She laid the groundwork for the religious patronage that would become one of the defining characteristics of the Mowbray family for generations to come. When young Roger came of age in 1138, he made a decision that would define his family for the next 4 centuries. He did not take his father's surname of d'Aubigny. Instead, he took the name of Mowbray, the name attached to the great Norman lordship that his father had received through his marriage to the imprisoned Robert de Mowbray's ex-wife. It was a deliberate and calculated choice. The name Mowbray carried the weight of history, the prestige of an ancient Norman lordship, and the resonance of a great feudal honour. By taking this name, Roger was declaring himself the heir not merely of his father's lands, but of an older and grander tradition. He was claiming a place in the Norman aristocracy that his family's d'Aubigny origins alone could not have guaranteed. From this moment forward, the d'Aubigny blood would flow under the Mowbray banner. The House of Mowbray, one of the most enduring noble dynasties in English history, was born. Roger de Mowbray came of age at a moment of extraordinary turmoil. England was tearing itself apart in a civil war that would last nearly 20 years and reduce much of the country to a landscape of burned villages, broken castles, and lawless roads where bandits preyed on travellers with impunity. King Henry I had died in 1135, reportedly from eating too many lampreys, a detail that the medieval chroniclers recorded with the kind of grim satisfaction that they reserved for the deaths of powerful men. And the crown was being fought over by 2 rival claimants. Stephen of Blois, the old king's nephew, had seized the throne with the support of many English barons and the tacit approval of the church. But Matilda, Henry's daughter, who had been designated as his heir and who had the stronger legal claim, refused to accept Stephen's usurpation. She gathered her own supporters, invaded England, and the kingdom plunged into a period of chaos and civil war that the contemporary chroniclers called, simply, the Anarchy. Roger was barely 18 when he first tasted battle. In 1138, a Scottish army under King David III of Scotland, who was supporting the Empress Matilda's cause, invaded northern England, burning and pillaging as they advanced. The English barons of the north rallied to meet the invaders, and among them was the young Roger de Mowbray, newly come into his inheritance and eager to prove himself. The 2 armies clashed on the 22nd of August 1138 at the Battle of the Standard, fought near Northallerton in the North Riding of Yorkshire. The battle took its name from a remarkable object that the English erected at the centre of their line, a great ship's mast, mounted on a cart, from which hung the consecrated banners of 3 northern saints, St. Cuthbert of Durham, St. Wilfrid of Ripon, and St. John of Beverley. It was a rallying point, a symbol of heavenly protection, and a defiant statement that the north of England would fight for itself against any invader, whether Scottish, Norman, or otherwise. According to the chronicler Aelred of Rievaulx, a monk at the great Yorkshire Abbey who wrote a detailed account of the battle, the young Roger de Mowbray acquitted himself honourably in the fighting. The English won a decisive victory, driving the Scottish army back across the border with heavy casualties. Roger emerged from the battle with his reputation enhanced and his confidence growing. He was described by contemporaries as a prodigious fighter, brave, skilled with weapons, physically powerful, and possessed of the kind of martial enthusiasm that the Norman aristocracy valued above almost everything else. But Roger's military fortunes, impressive as they were, proved to be distinctly mixed over the course of his long life. He had a talent for ending up on the losing side at critical moments. 3 years after his triumph at the Standard in 1141, Roger found himself fighting in one of the pivotal engagements of the Anarchy, the Battle of Lincoln, fought on the 2nd of February. Roger had sided with King Stephen, and when Stephen's army was overwhelmed by the forces of the Empress Matilda and her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, both the king and Roger were taken prisoner. The capture of a king was an extraordinary event, and it sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Stephen was dragged in chains to Bristol and held prisoner for months, and for a brief period Matilda came close to securing the English throne. Roger de Mowbray, too, was taken into captivity, though the details of his imprisonment and release are less well documented. He was eventually freed, probably ransomed as was the custom, but the experience of defeat and captivity must have been a sobering lesson for the young lord. Not long after his release, Roger married. His bride was Alice de Gaunt, the widow of Ilbert de Lacy, and the daughter of Walter de Gaunt, a Lincolnshire baron of some wealth. It was a good match. Alice brought with her additional lands and connections in Lincolnshire that complemented the Mowbray holdings in Yorkshire, and the marriage would produce at least 2 sons, Nigel and Robert, who would carry the Mowbray line forward into the next generation. But it was not as a soldier or a husband that Roger de Mowbray made his most enduring contribution to English history. It was as a pilgrim, a crusader, and a builder of religious houses. A man who poured his wealth, his energy, and his faith into the creation of an extraordinary network of monasteries, priories, churches, and hospitals that transformed the spiritual landscape of northern England. In 1147, Roger de Mowbray did something that very few English lords of his generation chose to do. He left England behind, with all its wars and politics and feudal obligations, and joined the Second Crusade, travelling with the army of King Louis VII of France to the Holy Land. The Second Crusade had been called by Pope Eugenius III in response to the fall of the county of Edessa, one of the 4 Crusader states established in the wake of the First Crusade, and it attracted enormous enthusiasm across Western Europe. But in England, enthusiasm was muted. Most of the English nobility stayed home, preoccupied with the ongoing civil war between Stephen and Matilda, and Roger de Mowbray was one of very few great English lords to take the cross. His decision to go on crusade speaks to a deep and genuine piety that ran through everything Roger did. He was not merely a soldier who happened to be religious, or a lord who patronized the church out of obligation. He was a man who seems to have been genuinely moved by the idea of holy warfare, by the call to defend the sacred places of Christianity, and by the example of the great monastic orders that he encountered in the East. The Second Crusade was, by most military measures, a failure. The combined armies of France and the Holy Roman Empire, led by Louis VII and the Emperor Conrad III, failed to capture Damascus, their primary objective. And the crusade ended in 1149 without achieving any of its major strategic goals. But for Roger de Mowbray personally, the experience was transformative. In the Holy Land, he saw things that he had never seen before. The great religious foundations of the Crusader states, the fortified monasteries, the hospitals where the sick and the wounded were cared for, by dedicated orders of monks and knights. He encountered the Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitaller, and the Order of St. Lazarus, which devoted itself to the care of lepers and other sufferers. These experiences fired Roger with a determination to build something similar on his own lands in England. One particular episode from the crusade passed into family legend. According to the chronicles, Roger de Mowbray fought a Muslim warrior in single combat during the expedition and emerged victorious. This feat of arms, a classic example of the kind of individual heroism that the medieval world celebrated above all else, enhanced Roger's reputation enormously, and it was remembered and retold for generations. When Roger returned to England around 1150, he threw himself into the work of religious patronage with an energy and generosity that was exceptional even by the standards of the 12th century. An age when lords competed with each other to found monasteries and endow churches as a way of securing their spiritual welfare and demonstrating their piety and wealth. Over the course of his long life, Roger de Mowbray is credited with helping to establish approximately 35 religious houses, an astonishing number that speaks to both his enormous wealth and his deep devotion. No other English lord of his generation came close to matching this record of patronage. His greatest foundation was Byland Abbey, which would become one of the finest Cistercian monasteries in England. The story of Byland's founding is itself a small epic. In 1138, when the Scottish army invaded Yorkshire, a group of monks from the Abbey of Calder in Cumberland fled south to escape the raiders. Roger and his mother Gundrida sheltered these displaced monks and gave them land near Thirsk, where they attempted to establish a new community. But the site proved unsuitable, and after several years of difficulty, including a bitter dispute with the monks of nearby Rievaulx Abbey over territory, Roger helped the monks relocate to Coxwold in 1147, where they would eventually build the magnificent abbey whose ruins still stand today, their great rose window open to the Yorkshire sky. Roger also founded Newburgh Priory, a house of Augustinian canons not far from Byland. He endowed the Church of Thirsk with 15 other churches and chapels across his Yorkshire estates, creating a network of parish churches that served the spiritual needs of his tenants and dependents. He was a generous benefactor to Fountains Abbey, Rievaulx Abbey, and Bridlington Priory, 3 of the greatest religious houses in the north of England. And he supported smaller foundations in Warwickshire, Northamptonshire, and Leicestershire as well. After returning from the Second Crusade, Roger made a particularly notable donation to the Order of St. Lazarus. He gave them 2 carucates of land, roughly 240 acres, along with a house and 2 mills at Burton St. Lazarus in Leicestershire. This grant established one of the most important leper hospitals in England, and the Mowbray connection with the order endured for many generations. The Mowbray lion rampant, the family's heraldic device, was eventually adopted by the hospital at Burton St. Lazarus and displayed alongside the order's own insignia, a visible testament to the bond between the family and the institution they had helped to create. Roger also gave substantial properties to the Knights Templar, including land in Warwickshire, where the Templars would build Temple Balsall, one of their most important English preceptories. The Templars drew more than £30 in annual rent from the various lands Roger had given them, a very considerable sum in the 12th century. But Roger's generosity came at a cost. By the end of his life, he had given away so much land to religious houses that his own domain, the estates he kept for his direct personal use, had been reduced to just 6 core manors. These manors were valuable, and some of them, such as Kirkby Malzeard in Yorkshire and the Isle of Axholme in Lincolnshire, consisted of multiple villages and lordships that generated substantial income. They were enough to keep the Mowbray family securely within the ranks of the English baronage. But the sheer scale of Roger's religious generosity had significantly diminished the family's overall land holdings from their peak. Roger also sold land on occasion, sometimes to raise money for his crusading expenses, and sometimes to settle debts, including debts to Jewish moneylenders who were among the principal financiers of the medieval English economy. On one occasion, he granted woodland to the Abbey of Combe in exchange for a payment that helped him clear his debts. These transactions suggest that Roger, for all his wealth, was not always flush with ready cash, a common situation for medieval lords whose riches were tied up in land rather than liquid assets. Roger de Mowbray was not always at peace with the English crown. In 1173, he joined the Great Revolt against King Henry II, a widespread rebellion that involved the king's own sons who were angry at their father's refusal to share power with them, and a coalition of discontented barons who resented Henry's tight control over English government. The revolt was supported by Louis XVII of France and William the Lion, King of Scotland, and it erupted simultaneously in England, Normandy, and Aquitaine. The rebellion failed. Henry II proved to be a formidable opponent, crushing the rebels one by one with a combination of military force and political skill. In Yorkshire, royal forces besieged and captured Roger de Mowbray's great castle at Thirsk, the ancestral seat of the Mowbray lordship, the castle that had been the administrative and military heart of the family's power for decades. When the rebellion was over, Henry II ordered Thirsk Castle demolished. The fortification was pulled down stone by stone, and the once proud fortress was reduced to the bare earthworks of its motte and bailey. Those earthworks survive to this day, visible as grass-covered humps on the outskirts of the modern town of Thirsk. A quiet, melancholy reminder of the price of defiance. The loss of Thirsk Castle was a heavy blow, but it did not destroy Roger de Mowbray. He retained his core estates, he kept his barony, and he continued his work of religious patronage. But as he grew older, the pull of the Holy Land, where he had fought and prayed as a young man, grew stronger and stronger. He had never forgotten his experiences on the Second Crusade, and in the last years of his life, Roger returned to the East. The timing could not have been worse. In 1187, the forces of Saladin, the great Muslim commander who had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, overwhelmed the army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem at the Battle of Hattin, fought on the 4th of July near the Sea of Galilee. Hattin was one of the most catastrophic military defeats in the history of the Crusader states. The Crusader army was virtually annihilated, its leaders killed or captured, and Saladin went on to conquer Jerusalem itself within 3 months. The shock of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem reverberated across the entire Christian world and triggered the Third Crusade, led by Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa. Among those caught up in the disaster of Hattin was the elderly Roger de Mowbray. He was captured by Saladin's forces after the battle and held as a prisoner. His ransom was paid by the Knights Templar, the military order he had supported so generously in England, a debt of honour repaid in the most literal way possible. But Roger did not long survive his release. He was an old man, exhausted by captivity and the rigours of campaigning in the heat and dust of the Holy Land, and he died in 1188 at the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. Roger de Mowbray was approximately 68 years old when he died. He had lived one of the most eventful and remarkable lives of any English lord of his generation. A life that spanned the anarchy, 2 crusades, a rebellion against his own king, the founding of 35 religious houses, and death in the Holy Land, thousands of miles from the Yorkshire hills where he had been born. He was a man of contradictions, a soldier who built monasteries, a rebel who founded hospitals, a lord who gave away so much of his wealth that he impoverished his own descendants. But above all, he was a man of deep and genuine faith, and the religious houses he endowed, many of which continued to flourish for 4 centuries until their dissolution by Henry VIII in the 1530s, were the most enduring monuments to his life and character. Roger's legacy extended beyond his religious foundations. He had given the Mowbray family its name, its identity, and its place in the English aristocracy. He had demonstrated that a family of relatively modest Norman origins could rise through military service, religious patronage, and sheer force of personality to a position of genuine importance in English life. Every subsequent Mowbray, every baron, every earl, every duke, owed something to the crusading lord who had taken a new surname and ridden out to fight at the Battle of the Standard as a teenager, full of ambition and faith and the restless energy of youth. Roger's son, Nigel de Mowbray, inherited the family estates, but Nigel's own life was cut short by the Crusades, the same calling that had consumed his father. Nigel joined the Third Crusade, the great expedition led by Richard the Lionheart to recapture Jerusalem after its fall to Saladin. He died during the siege of Acre in 1191, just 3 years after his father's death. Like Roger, Nigel gave his life in the service of the cross, on a distant shore, far from home. He left behind young children, including a son named William, and it would be William who would carry the Mowbray name into the most turbulent century in English history. A century of Magna Carta, civil war, and the making of the English Constitution. William de Mowbray was born around 1173, and he grew up in the shadow of his father's and grandfather's crusading legends. But William would make his own mark on English history in a very different way. He would not ride to Jerusalem. He would not build abbeys in the Yorkshire hills. Instead, William de Mowbray would stand in a meadow beside the River Thames on a summer day in 1215 and help force an English king to submit to the law. William was described by a contemporary chronicler in vivid and memorable terms. He was, the writer said, small as a dwarf, but very generous and valiant. It is the kind of phrase that stays in the mind across the centuries. A man whose physical stature bore no relation whatsoever to the size of his ambitions, his courage, or his moral convictions. William de Mowbray was a lord of the old school, deeply committed to the ancient principle that even a king must govern within the bounds of custom and consent, that the crown was not a license for tyranny, and that when a ruler overstepped the limits of acceptable behavior, his subjects had the right, perhaps even the duty, to resist. The king who provoked this resistance was John. King John, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, has come down through history as one of the most unpopular rulers England ever had, a reputation that owes much to Shakespeare, to Robin Hood, and to the simple fact that John managed to alienate almost everyone who mattered. He had lost most of England's French territories through a combination of military incompetence and political miscalculation. He had quarrelled bitterly and publicly with the Pope, resulting in England being placed under a papal interdict, a form of spiritual sanction that closed every church in the kingdom and denied the sacraments to every man, woman, and child. And he had taxed his English barons to the point of desperation, squeezing them for money to fund his failed military campaigns on the continent. By 1215, William de Mowbray and a large group of English lords had had enough. They gathered their forces, seized the city of London, and confronted the king with a list of demands that they insisted he accept. The negotiations took place at Runnymede, a flat water meadow on the banks of the Thames near Windsor, neutral ground between the king's stronghold at Windsor Castle and the barons' base in London. On the 15th of June, 1215, King John set his seal to the document that would become known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It was a remarkable document running to 63 clauses that sought to establish limits on royal power and guarantee certain rights to the English barons, the English church, and, in a few revolutionary clauses, to all free men of the kingdom. It guaranteed that no free man would be imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, or destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, a principle that would later be understood as the foundation of habeas corpus and the right to a fair trial. It limited the king's power to impose taxes and feudal levies without the common consent of the realm. It established procedures for the redress of grievances and the accountability of royal officers. It was not a democratic document in any modern sense. Its primary concern was the protection of baronial privilege, but its principles would echo down through the centuries and become one of the cornerstones of constitutional government, not just in England, but across the world, from the American Constitution to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. William de Mowbray was appointed one of the 25 barons charged with enforcing the terms of Magna Carta. These 25 men were given the extraordinary authority to compel the king to obey the charter, by force if necessary, and to seize his castles, lands, and possessions if he refused to comply. It was a radical and dangerous responsibility, and it placed William de Mowbray squarely at the centre of the most important constitutional crisis in English history. King John, however, had no intention of honouring the charter. He had sealed it under duress, and he immediately began working to have it annulled. He appealed to Pope Innocent III, who obligingly declared Magna Carta null and void and excommunicated the rebel barons. England plunged into civil war, and William de Mowbray, along with the other enforcers of the charter, found himself an outlaw in his own country. The barons, desperate for military support, took the extraordinary step of inviting Prince Louis of France, the heir to the French throne, to come to England and claim the crown. Louis accepted, landed with a French army, and for a brief period it seemed possible that England might become a French vassal state. But King John died in October 1219, and the succession of his 9-year-old son Henry III, under the regency of the capable and moderate William Marshal, took much of the energy out of the rebel cause. Many barons who had opposed John were willing to give the boy king a chance, but not all of them submitted quickly enough. In 1217, at the Second Battle of Lincoln, fought in the streets and castle of the same city where William's grandfather Roger had been captured alongside King Stephen 76 years earlier, a royalist army defeated the baronial and French forces, and William de Mowbray was taken prisoner. History, it seemed, had a grim and repetitive sense of humour when it came to the Mowbray family and the city of Lincoln. William was eventually ransomed and released. He returned to his estates in the north of England, chastened but unbroken, and he lived out the remainder of his life in relative peace. He died around 1224 at Epworth, in the Isle of Axholme in Lincolnshire, the low-lying marshy peninsula that had been part of the Mowbray estates since Nigel d'Aubigny's time, and that would remain the family's most enduring stronghold for the next 2.5 centuries. The manor house at Epworth, known as Vinigurth, stood on the land where St Andrew's Church now rises, and a blue plaque on the modern building commemorates William de Mowbray's role as one of the guardians of Magna Carta. William's eldest son, Nigel, inherited the family estates but died without issue in 1230. The lordship then passed to William's younger son, Roger, who served in the Scottish and Welsh campaigns of Henry III's reign, and died in 1266. Roger's son, yet another Roger, would become the first member of the family to hold the formal title of Baron Mowbray, a title that would anchor the family's place in the English peerage for the rest of their history. In 1295, King Edward III summoned a great parliament that would later be called the Model Parliament, because it included representatives from every major class of English society: lords, bishops, abbots, knights of the shires, and burgesses from the towns. Among those who received a writ of summons was Roger de Mowbray, and that writ formally recognised him as a baron of the realm. The barony of Mowbray, traditionally dated to 1283 from an earlier writ, became one of the oldest formally recognised peerages in England, a distinction that it holds to this day. The first Baron Mowbray died in 1297, and his son John succeeded him as the second Baron Mowbray. John was a capable and experienced lord who served the crown with distinction in the Scottish wars of Edward III. He held the offices of Sheriff of Yorkshire, Governor of the City of York, and Warden of the Scottish Marches, and he was the governor of both Malton and Scarborough castles. He was precisely the kind of tough, experienced northern lord that the English crown relied upon to hold the borderlands against Scottish incursion, a man who understood warfare, diplomacy, and the hard business of governing a frontier. But John de Mowbray lived in increasingly dangerous times. Edward I died in 1307, and his son, Edward II, proved to be one of the weakest and most disastrous kings in English history. Where Edward I had been stern, martial, and respected, Edward II was indecisive, pleasure-loving, and fatally dependent on a series of male favourites who aroused the jealousy and fury of the English baronage. His first favourite, Piers Gaveston, was so resented by the barons that they eventually seized and murdered him. His second set of favourites, Hugh Despenser the Elder and Hugh Despenser the Younger, proved even more destructive. They used their influence over the king to enrich themselves at the expense of their rivals, and they drove the English nobility to the brink of revolt. John de Mowbray, 2nd Baron Mowbray, found himself drawn into the orbit of Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin, the richest nobleman in England, and the leader of the baronial opposition to Edward II and the Despensers. Lancaster was a man of enormous wealth and enormous grievances, convinced that the king was being led astray by evil counsellors and that the only remedy was force. When Lancaster raised the standard of rebellion in early 1322, John de Mowbray marched with him. It was a fateful decision. The rebellion collapsed almost immediately. Lancaster's forces, which had been marching south toward the royal army, were intercepted at the town of Boroughbridge in the West Riding of Yorkshire on the 16th of March, 1322. The Royalist army, commanded by Sir Andrew Harclay, the Sheriff of Cumberland, a hard and experienced soldier, held the bridge over the River Ure and blocked the rebel advance. Lancaster attempted to force the crossing but was beaten back. His Welsh pikemen, who were supposed to ford the river upstream and attack Harclay's flank, were repulsed by volleys of arrows. By the end of the day, the rebel cause was lost. Lancaster and his followers, including John de Mowbray, were forced to surrender. King Edward II rode north to personally supervise the punishment of the rebels, and he showed no mercy whatsoever. In the weeks that followed Boroughbridge, Edward executed approximately 24 rebel lords. A mass judicial killing that was without precedent in English history, and that shocked even those who had supported the royal cause. Lancaster himself was beheaded at Pontefract Castle on the 22nd of March, after a trial that was little more than a public humiliation. The other rebels were dealt with equally swiftly. Among those who died was John de Mowbray, 2nd Baron Mowbray. On the 23rd of March 1322, John was hanged at York. He was 35 years old. The manner of his death was deliberately degrading. Hanging was considered a shameful death, far beneath the dignity of a baron, who would normally have expected to be beheaded if sentenced to death for treason. The king's choice of execution method was a calculated insult, designed to humiliate the Mowbray family and demonstrate the crown's absolute power over life and death. But the humiliation did not end with the execution. According to contemporary accounts, John's body was left to hang and rot for an extended period. The vindictive king and the Despensers refusing to allow his family to take it down for burial. The corpse swung in the wind above the city of York, a ghastly public warning to anyone who might consider rebellion. It was only after a prolonged period that the family was finally permitted to retrieve the body and bury it in the Church of the Dominican Friars in York. John's wife, Aline de Braos, the daughter of William de Braos, 2nd Baron Braos, and the heiress of the lordship of Gower, was seized by the crown along with their young son, also named John. Mother and child were thrown into the Tower of London, and the Mowbray estates were confiscated and redistributed to men who had remained loyal to the king. It was the lowest point in the history of the Mowbray family since the imprisonment of Robert de Mowbray, Earl of Northumbria, more than 2 centuries earlier. The head of the house was dead, his body publicly displayed as a warning. His wife and child were prisoners. Their lands were gone, their name disgraced, and their future looked as bleak as the winter sky over York. But the wheel of fortune, which the medieval world believed governed the fates of men and nations, was about to turn again. In 1327, King Edward II's own queen, Isabella of France, known to history as the She-Wolf of France, returned from exile with her lover Roger Mortimer and a small army of mercenaries. Edward fled before them, was captured, and was forced to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son, who became King Edward III. The Despensers, who had wielded such terrible power during Edward II's reign, were hunted down and executed, and the prisoners of the old regime were released. Aline de Braos walked out of the Tower of London with her young son John. Their lands were restored, their title was reinstated, and John de Mowbray, still a child, barely old enough to understand the political upheavals that had shaped his life, became the third Baron Mowbray. The third Baron grew up to be a cautious and pragmatic lord. The lesson of his father's fate, that rebellion against the crown could cost you everything, including your life and your family's honour, was burned into his consciousness, and he never forgot it. He served the English kings with careful loyalty, fighting in the Scottish wars as his father and grandfather had done, and he avoided the kind of political entanglement that had destroyed the second Baron. John married Joan Plantagenet, a great-granddaughter of King Henry III, and this marriage lifted the Mowbray family into the highest circles of the English aristocracy. Through Joan, the Mowbrays could claim descent from the royal House of England itself, a connection that would become increasingly important as the family rose in power and influence over the following generations. The third Baron died on the 4th of October 1361, during a second devastating wave of the Black Death, the Great Plague that had first swept through England in 1348 and 49, and returned periodically throughout the 14th century. He was 51 years old, and he died at York. His son, John, 4th Baron Mowbray, was born on the 24th of June 1340 at Epworth, and he inherited his father's title at the age of 21. He served King Edward III in the 100 Years' War, campaigning in France in the mid-1350s, and he was knighted by the king himself in July 1355, while the English forces were at the Downs, preparing to cross the Channel. But it was the 4th Baron's marriage that would prove to be the transformative event of his generation. He married Elizabeth de Segrave, the daughter of John, Lord Segrave, and his wife Margaret of Brotherton, the Duchess of Norfolk. And Margaret of Brotherton was the daughter of Thomas of Brotherton, the first Earl of Norfolk, who was himself the 5th son of King Edward I. This marriage, the union of Mowbray and Segrave, with its connection to the Brotherton inheritance and the Earldom of Norfolk, was the pivot on which the entire subsequent history of the Mowbray family turned. Through Elizabeth Segrave and through her mother, Margaret of Brotherton, the Mowbrays would eventually acquire the Earldom of Norfolk, the office of Earl Marshal, and the vast Brotherton estates in East Anglia and beyond. It was this marriage, more than any battle or rebellion, that transformed the Mowbrays from wealthy northern barons into one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. But the 4th Baron did not live to see the full fruits of this union. In 1368, he set out on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, following in the footsteps of his ancestor Roger de Mowbray, who had died at Tyre nearly 200 years earlier. It was as if the pull of the East, which had drawn Roger across the Mediterranean and into the arms of death, still exerted its force on the Mowbray blood 2 centuries later. The men of this family seemed drawn to the Holy Land the way moths are drawn to flame, compelled by faith, by tradition, by some deep impulse that defied rational explanation. But John, 4th Baron, never reached Jerusalem. He was killed near Constantinople on the 19th of October, 1368, under circumstances that the sources do not fully explain. Constantinople, the great city on the Bosphorus, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the ancient crossroads between Europe and Asia. was a common waypoint for pilgrims travelling to the Holy Land by land, and many English travellers passed through its gates on their way to and from Jerusalem. What happened to John there? Whether he died of disease or accident or violence, we simply do not know. He was 28 years old, and his death marked yet another generation of Mowbrays, cut short in the prime of life. His wife, Elizabeth de Segrave, died in the same year, also at the age of 28. Whether she accompanied her husband on his pilgrimage, or whether she died separately in England, the sources do not tell us clearly. What is certain is that the coincidence of both parents dying in the same year left their 5 children, 3 daughters and 2 sons, as orphans. The elder son, John, was just 3 years old. The younger, Thomas, was 2. Both boys became wards of the English crown, their vast inheritance held in trust by guardians appointed by the king, and their fates would diverge in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The story of Thomas Mowbray, the man who would become the first Duke of Norfolk, the man who would be immortalized by William Shakespeare, the man who would die in exile in the most beautiful city in Europe, begins with the remarkable woman who controlled the fortune he spent his entire life trying to inherit. Her name was Margaret of Brotherton, and she was one of the most formidable figures of the 14th century. Margaret was the daughter of Thomas of Brotherton, the first Earl of Norfolk, who was the eldest son of King Edward de Thurnes by his second marriage to Margaret of France. Through her father, Margaret was the granddaughter of a king, and she carried herself accordingly. She was born around 1322, and she would live to be nearly 80 years old. An extraordinary age for anyone in the medieval period, let alone a woman who had survived the Black Death, multiple marriages, and the endless political upheavals of the 14th century. When her brother Edward died without children, Margaret inherited the Earldom of Norfolk and the office of Earl Marshal, the great hereditary officership that was responsible for organising royal ceremonies, managing the College of Heralds, and adjudicating matters of honour and chivalry. Margaret was, as far as history records, the only woman ever to serve as Earl Marshal of England. It was a position of enormous prestige and practical authority, and she held it with a firmness that frustrated everyone who dealt with her for the next 6 decades. Margaret married twice, first to John Seagrave, 4th Baron Seagrave, and then to Sir Walter Morney, a distinguished Flemish-born soldier and Knight of the Garter who had won fame fighting for Edward III in the 100 Years' War. Through her first marriage, Margaret had a daughter named Elizabeth, who married John de Mowbray, 4th Baron Mowbray. When the 4th Baron and Elizabeth both died in 1368, Margaret became the custodian of her grandchildren's interests, and she held onto her estates and her titles with a tenacity that bordered on stubbornness. Margaret, Duchess of Norfolk, did not die until the 24th of March, 1399. Her extraordinary longevity meant that the vast Brotherton estates, the great lands of East Anglia and beyond, remained firmly in her hands for the entire lifetime of her grandson, Thomas Mowbray. Thomas would spend his entire adult life as one of the most powerful men in England, holding the offices of Earl Marshal and Duke of Norfolk, but he would never lay hands on the Brotherton inheritance that was rightfully his by descent. His grandmother outlived him by mere days, and political catastrophe ensured that the estates passed not to Thomas's heirs, but into the clutches of the crown. It was one of the most exquisite pieces of bad timing in English history. But let us return to the 2 orphaned Mowbray boys, John and Thomas, and follow the path that led Thomas to the dukedom, to Shakespeare's stage, and to a lonely death in Venice. John de Mowbray, the elder brother, was born on the 1st of August 1365 at Epworth. Thomas was born on the 22nd of March 1366 at the same manor house, probably named after the cult of St. Thomas Becket, to which his mother was devoted. After their parents' deaths in 1368, The brothers became wards of the crown, and their guardianship was eventually entrusted to their great-aunt Blanche of Lancaster. John grew up to become a young man of considerable promise and personal charm. He was apparently close to the young King Richard II. One source describes him as a special friend of the king, and at Richard's coronation in July 1377, John was created Earl of Nottingham. He was just 12 years old, and the earldom was a mark of royal favour that reflected both his personal qualities and the importance of his family. But John de Mowbray, first Earl of Nottingham, was not destined for a long life. He died on the 12th of January, 1383, at the Isle of Axholme, at the age of 17. He had never married and had no children. The cause of his death is not recorded in the sources, and we can only speculate about what cut short the life of this promising young lord. Disease, accident, or simple ill fortune? Any of these might have been responsible. Within days of John's death, the earldom of Nottingham was re-granted to his younger brother Thomas. At 17, Thomas Mowbray became the head of one of the most important noble families in England, and he immediately began to make his presence felt on the national stage. Thomas Mowbray was ambitious, politically shrewd, and, like many of his contemporaries in the turbulent world of late 14th century England, willing to take dangerous risks in pursuit of power. The England of his youth was a kingdom in crisis. Richard II was an intelligent but deeply flawed king, convinced of his own divine right to rule without constraint, surrounded by favourites whom the great lords despised, and increasingly prone to the kind of arbitrary behaviour that alienated his most powerful subjects. In 1387, the tensions between Richard and his barons erupted into open confrontation. A group of 5 powerful lords, known to history as the Lords Appellant, challenged the king's authority directly, accusing his closest advisers of treason and demanding their removal from office. The 5 Lords Appellant were Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, the future King Henry IV, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, Richard Fitzalan, Earl of Arundel, Thomas de Beauchamp, Earl of Warwick, and Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham. The Lords Appellant marched on London with their armed retinues, defeated the king's forces at the Battle of Radcot Bridge in Oxfordshire, where the king's champion, Robert de Vere, Duke of Ireland, was routed and forced to flee across the frozen Thames, and effectively seized control of the government. In the Parliament that followed, known as the Merciless Parliament of 1388, they impeached and executed several of the king's most prominent supporters, including Simon Burley, the royal tutor who had been one of Richard's closest personal friends, and Robert Tresilian, the Chief Justice. The proceedings were savage and vindictive, and they left Richard humiliated, powerless, and burning with a desire for revenge that he would nurse for nearly a decade. Thomas Mowbray played his part in the Lords Appellant movement with skill and ruthlessness, though he was the youngest and least experienced of the 5. He was learning his trade in the hardest school imaginable, the school of late medieval English faction fighting, where today's ally was tomorrow's victim and the price of miscalculation was death. But Thomas was also a pragmatist, and when the political winds shifted, he shifted with them. In 1389, Richard reasserted his authority, not through force but through the simple expedient of declaring himself of age and dismissing the appellant's officers. And Thomas Mowbray made his peace with the king. He was employed on military and diplomatic missions throughout the early 1390s, serving as captain of Calais, England's last remaining possession on the continent, and commanding forces in Ireland. The reconciliation seemed genuine, and Richard rewarded Thomas for his renewed loyalty. In September 1397, the king created Thomas Mowbray the first Duke of Norfolk. The dukedom was one of the highest honours the crown could bestow, and it placed Thomas among the most exalted men in the kingdom. The Mowbray family, which had begun as minor Norman landholders, had reached the pinnacle of the English aristocracy. But the dukedom came stained with blood. In the same year that Thomas was elevated to duke, Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, one of his former fellow lords appellant and the king's own uncle, was arrested on the orders of King Richard II. Gloucester was taken to Calais, where Thomas Mowbray was captain, and he never returned. The official account was that Gloucester had died of natural causes while in custody. Nobody believed it. The widespread conviction, then and now, was that Gloucester had been murdered, almost certainly on the orders of King Richard, and that Thomas Mowbray, as captain of Calais, was complicit in the killing. The precise nature of Thomas Mowbray's involvement remains one of the enduring puzzles of late medieval English history. He may have been the direct instrument of the king's will, personally overseeing or even carrying out the murder. He may have been a reluctant accomplice, aware of what was happening behind the walls of Calais, but unable or unwilling to prevent it. Or he may have been something in between. A man who understood that his own survival depended on doing whatever Richard demanded, no matter how ugly. What is certain is that the weight of Gloucester's death hung over Thomas Mowbray for the rest of his life, and it led directly to the most famous episode in the entire Mowbray saga. At some point in late 1397 or early 1398, Thomas Mowbray had a private conversation with Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, his former ally among the lords appellant. According to the accounts that survive, Thomas confided to Bolingbroke that he feared the king was planning to arrest him, that Richard intended to take revenge on the former lords appellant one by one, and that neither Thomas nor Bolingbroke was safe. He may have suggested that they should take steps to protect themselves. Bolingbroke did not respond as Thomas expected. Instead of entering into a pact of mutual defence, Bolingbroke went straight to King Richard and accused Mowbray of treason, of making seditious and disloyal statements about the king. It was the ultimate betrayal of a confidence, and it placed Thomas Mowbray in mortal danger. Thomas denied everything. He called Bolingbroke a liar and a slanderer. When the two men could not settle their dispute by words, they agreed to settle it by arms. A trial by combat, a judicial duel in which God was supposed to reveal the truth by granting victory to the righteous party, was arranged at Gosford Green, near Coventry, for the 16th of September, 1398. The scene that unfolded at Coventry was one of the most theatrical moments in English history. So dramatic, so charged with political meaning and personal enmity, that William Shakespeare would later immortalize it as the opening act of his play, Richard II. The two dukes rode into the lists in full armour, each accompanied by his retinue, his heralds, and his armed supporters. The spectators, the king, the court, the lords and ladies of England, filled the stands and strained forward to watch. The heralds read the formal charges and countercharges. Bolingbroke accused Mowbray of treason. Mowbray denied it and threw down his gauntlet. The formalities were observed. The oaths were sworn. The weapons were inspected. The prayers were said. The two men took their positions at opposite ends of the lists, their lances couched, their visors down, their war horses stamping and snorting in the autumn air. The trumpets sounded. The charge was about to begin. And then, at the very last moment, with the entire court holding its breath, with two of the most powerful men in England poised to ride at each other at full gallop with sharpened lances, King Richard threw down his warder. The umpire's baton clattered onto the ground, and the marshal of the lists ordered the combatants to halt. Richard consulted briefly with his advisers. The pause stretched out, the tension unbearable. And then the king announced his judgment. Both men were to be banished from England. Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, was banished for life. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, was banished for 10 years, subsequently reduced to 6. Thomas Mowbray was shattered. He stood before the king and spoke with a raw, unguarded emotion that the chronicles record and that Shakespeare would later transform into some of the most powerful lines in his play. He compared his banishment to imprisonment, saying that, as a man who spoke only English, exile in a foreign land would rob him of his tongue, his identity, and his very sense of self. He would be a stranger everywhere, unable to communicate, unable to plead his case, unable to live as the man he was. For a medieval lord and whose entire identity was bound up in his lands, his titles, his household, and his language, permanent exile was a kind of living death. Richard was unmoved. Both men were required to swear on the king's sword that they would never see each other, write to each other, or communicate in any way ever again. They were forbidden from plotting against the king, and they were ordered to leave England immediately. Thomas Mowbray departed. He crossed the Channel, travelled through France, and eventually made his way south through the Alpine passes to Italy. He may have travelled through the German lands as well. The chronicles are vague about his exact route. But his ultimate destination was Venice, the great mercantile republic on the Adriatic coast, one of the richest, most cosmopolitan, and most sophisticated cities in the world. Venice was a common destination for English exiles of high status. It was neutral territory beyond the reach of the English crown, but connected by trade to every corner of Europe and the Mediterranean. It was also a city of extraordinary beauty, its palaces and churches rising from the waters of the lagoon, its canals alive with gondolas and trading vessels. In Venice, Thomas attempted to organize his affairs and come to terms with a future that held no promise of return. He was 32 years old, a man in the prime of his life, the holder of one of the greatest titles in England, and yet he was utterly powerless. Cut off from his lands, his family, his language, and everything that had given his life meaning. The exile was, as he had predicted, a kind of living death. In March 1399, while Thomas was in exile, his grandmother, Margaret of Brotherton, finally died at the age of nearly 80. Her death should have released the vast Brotherton estates to the Mowbray family at last. But Thomas had been granted letters of protection before his banishment, legal documents that allowed him to claim any new inheritance that fell to him while he was abroad. On the very same day that Richard II announced the confiscation of Henry Bolingbroke's Lancastrian inheritance, a provocative and reckless act that would trigger Bolingbroke's return and ultimately Richard's downfall. The king also cancelled Thomas Mowbray's letters of protection. The Brotherton estates, which the Mowbrays had waited decades to inherit, slipped through their fingers at the worst possible moment. Thomas Mowbray would never return to England. On the 22nd of September 1399, he died in Venice. The cause of his death was the plague, the great recurring pestilence that swept through Europe's cities with terrifying regularity throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. He was 33 years old. Thomas was buried in Venice, apparently in or near the great Basilica of St. Mark. His tombstone bore a remarkable collection of heraldic symbols that told the story of his divided loyalties: the royal arms of England, the Mowbray lion rampant, Richard II's badge of the White Hart, and the White Swan of Henry Bolingbroke. Even in death, Thomas Mowbray was caught between two kings, the one who had banished him and the one who was, at that very moment, overthrowing him. Back in England, the political world that Thomas had known was collapsing. Henry Bolingbroke had returned from exile, raised an army, and marched on London. Richard II, abandoned by his supporters and trapped in Wales, was forced to surrender. On the 30th of September, 1399, just 8 days after Thomas Mowbray's death in Venice, Richard II was formally deposed. Bolingbroke seized the throne as King Henry IV, and the Lancastrian dynasty, which would rule England for the next 60 years, was born. The Mowbray family, leaderless and dispossessed, was left to navigate a new and dangerous world. Thomas Mowbray, the first Duke of Norfolk, left behind 5 children, 2 sons and 3 daughters, and a legacy of brilliance, betrayal, and unfulfilled promise. His wife, Elizabeth Fitzalan, was the daughter of Richard Fitzalan, the 4th Earl of Arundel, and she was made of stern stuff. She would outlive her husband by more than 1/4 of a century. She would marry 3 more times after Thomas's exile and death, and she would hold on to 1/3 of the Mowbray estates in dower throughout her long life, a fact that would cause considerable financial hardship to her own sons. The eldest of those sons was Thomas, named, like his father, after St. Thomas Becket. The younger Thomas inherited his father's earldoms of Norfolk and Nottingham, but not the dukedom, which was considered forfeited by the father's banishment and death in exile. This younger Thomas was born around 1386, and he grew up in the shadow of his father's dramatic rise and fall. He was a teenager during the early, uncertain years of the Lancastrian regime, and he inherited not only his father's titles, but his father's burning sense of grievance, a conviction that the Mowbray family had been wronged by the crown, that their honour had been besmirched, and that the wrong must be righted. The England of the early 15th century was a tense and anxious kingdom. Henry IV had seized the crown by force, deposing and, almost certainly, ordering the murder of his predecessor Richard II. The new king knew that his hold on power was fragile, and he was haunted by the fear of rebellion. Across the country, supporters of the old regime plotted and schemed. Some believed that Richard was still alive, hidden away in some secret prison, waiting for the moment to reclaim his throne. Others simply resented the upstart Lancastrian dynasty and longed for a return to the old order. The young Thomas Mowbray was drawn into one of the most dangerous of these conspiracies. In the summer of 1405, Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, one of the most senior and respected churchmen in England, raised the standard of rebellion against Henry IV. Scrope's grievances were a potent mixture of the personal, the political, and the spiritual. He objected to the heavy taxation that Henry had imposed to fund his wars against Welsh rebels, Scottish invaders, and French opportunists. He was outraged by the king's interference in church affairs, and he believed sincerely and passionately that Henry's seizure of the throne was a sin against God, a violation of the sacred order that bound king and kingdom together under divine authority. Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham and Earl Marshal, rode north to join the Archbishop. He was perhaps 19 years old, young, angry, and desperate to restore his family's fortunes. The rebellion attracted significant support in Yorkshire and the north, where resentment of the Lancastrian regime was strongest, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the uprising might succeed. It did not. Henry IV's response was swift and cunning. He dispatched Ralph Neville, Earl of Westmoreland, one of the most experienced and politically astute men in the kingdom, to deal with the rebels. Westmoreland confronted the rebel army at Shipton Moor in Yorkshire, but instead of offering battle, he offered to negotiate. He told the Archbishop and Thomas Mowbray that the king was willing to listen to their grievances, that a peaceful resolution was possible, and that no harm would come to them if they agreed to talks. Scrope and Mowbray believed him. They dismissed their followers, sent their soldiers home, and rode out to meet Westmoreland with only a small escort. When they arrived at the appointed meeting place, they were seized. It was a trap, cold, calculated, and ruthlessly effective. The consequences were immediate and terrible. King Henry IV rode north in person, and despite the horrified protests of his Chief Justice, who argued that an archbishop could not lawfully be executed by secular authority, Henry ordered both Scrope and Thomas Mowbray put to death. the Archbishop was beheaded outside the walls of York on the 8th of June, 1405. Thomas Mowbray, Earl of Nottingham and Earl Marshal, was beheaded alongside him. Thomas was approximately 19 years old. His head was placed on a spike. Some accounts say on Bootham Bar, one of the great medieval gates of York, while others say on a stake on Ouse Bridge. As a public warning to anyone who might think of challenging the Lancastrian regime, it was a grim and deliberate echo of the fate that had befallen John de Mowbray, the second Baron, at the same city 83 years earlier. Once again, a Mowbray had defied the crown. Once again, York had been the place of execution. And once again, the family had been brought to its knees by the consequences of rebellion. The Archbishop's execution was equally shocking and perhaps even more consequential. The killing of an archbishop by a secular ruler was almost unheard of in medieval Christendom, the most famous precedent being the murder of Thomas Becket in Canterbury Cathedral in 1170, which had haunted the English crown for 2 centuries. Henry IV had crossed a line that few kings dared to approach, and the execution of Archbishop Scrope generated enormous public outrage, particularly in the north of England. Within months, miracles were being reported at Scrope's tomb in York Minster, and a popular cult sprang up that venerated the dead archbishop as a martyr and a saint. Some contemporaries believed that Henry IV's subsequent ill health — he suffered from a painful and debilitating skin disease that plagued him for the rest of his life — was divine punishment for the murder of an archbishop. But the Mowbray line was not yet extinguished. Thomas's younger brother John, the second son of the first Duke of Norfolk, was still alive. He was approximately 13 years old when his brother was beheaded, and he had played no part whatsoever in the rebellion. He was a child, innocent of any involvement in the conspiracy, and even the Lancastrian regime recognized that punishing a boy for the crimes of his older brother would strain the boundaries of justice. Nonetheless, the attainder that followed Thomas's execution stripped the family of its remaining titles and estates, and John Mowbray found himself in a position of extreme vulnerability. A teenager with a disgraced name, no lands, no titles, no income, and no protector. In 1407, the Crown arranged for John to be placed in the wardship of his great-aunt Joan Fitzalan, Countess of Hereford, who was also, and this was no coincidence, the mother-in-law of King Henry IV himself. It was a placement designed to keep the young Mowbray close to the court and under careful surveillance, but it also gave John something invaluable: access to the highest levels of English society, a front-row seat at the workings of royal government, and an education in the subtle arts of survival. John Mowbray learned his lessons well. He watched, he listened, he observed the way power worked in the Lancastrian court: who was rewarded, who was punished, who survived, and who did not. And he drew conclusions that would guide his behavior for the rest of his life. He did not follow his brother's example. He did not plot against the king. He did not make alliances with discontented lords. He did not make speeches about honor or revenge or the rights of his family. Instead, he did something far more difficult and far more effective. He waited. He served. He was patient. He made himself useful to the very regime that had destroyed his brother. And he married well. It was a strategy that required enormous self-discipline and a kind of courage that was very different from the martial bravery that the Mowbrays had always prized. It takes a particular kind of strength to swallow your pride, to serve the people who killed your brother, to smile at the man who lured him to his death. John Mowbray possessed that strength, and it would serve him better than any sword. In 1412, John Mowbray married Catherine Neville, a daughter of Ralph Neville, 1st Earl of Westmoreland, the very man whose cunning had trapped and destroyed his brother. It was a marriage that might have seemed impossibly bitter, a union between the son of the victim and the daughter of the man who had engineered the betrayal. But in the ruthless world of late medieval English politics, yesterday's enemies were tomorrow's allies, and a good marriage was worth more than a century of grudges. Catherine's sister Cecily, known to later generations as the Rose of Raby for her legendary beauty, would marry Richard, Duke of York, and become the mother of two future kings of England, Edward IV and Richard III. This meant that John Mowbray, through his marriage to Catherine, became uncle by marriage to the future Yorkist kings. The web of family connections that bound the English aristocracy together was growing ever tighter, and the Mowbrays were woven into its very centre. It is worth pausing to appreciate just how interconnected the great noble families of 15th century England had become by this point. The Mowbrays, the Nevilles, the Plantagenets, the Fitzalans, the Talbots, the Beauforts. They were all related to each other by blood or marriage, sometimes several times over. This web of kinship meant that every political crisis was also a family crisis. Every war a conflict between cousins, every execution the death of someone's brother-in-law or nephew. The personal and the political were inseparable, and the consequences of this entanglement would become horrifyingly clear when the Wars of the Roses tore the English aristocracy apart. When Henry IV died in 1413 and was succeeded by his eldest son, the dazzling and warlike Henry V, John Mowbray's long patience began to bear fruit. Henry V was a different kind of king from his cautious, suspicious father. He was energetic, charismatic, and focused on the great project of conquering France, a vision that left him little time or inclination for pursuing old grudges against the families of his father's enemies. One of the old king's last acts had been to restore John Mowbray to full possession of his ancestral estates, and at Henry V's coronation on the 9th of April, 1413, John exercised for the first time the ancient office of Earl Marshal. John Mowbray served Henry V loyally throughout the king's short but spectacular reign. He supported the crown's military campaigns in France, though he does not appear to have fought at Agincourt in October 1415, the battle that made Henry IV immortal and that remains to this day one of the most celebrated victories in all of English history. He attended the king's councils. He administered his estates with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that reliability was worth more than glory. And he demonstrated year after year the kind of steady, undramatic loyalty that the Lancastrian regime needed from its great lords. It was a different kind of service from the martial heroism that had defined his ancestors. Roger the Crusader, William the Magna Carta Baron, Thomas the Duke who quarrelled with Bolingbroke. John Mowbray did not seek the limelight. He did not ride to the Holy Land, or stand in a meadow defying a king, or face down a rival in the lists at Coventry. He simply turned up, did his duty, kept his counsel, and waited for the world to turn in his favour. It was not the stuff of legend, but it was the stuff of survival. And in the brutal world of 15th century English politics, survival was the rarest and most precious achievement of all. The reward came in 1425. Henry VIII had died in 1422, cut down by dysentery at the age of 35, at the very height of his power, in the midst of his conquest of France, and his infant son, Henry VI, just 9 months old, had been proclaimed king under the guardianship of a regency council. The council was led by some of the most capable men in England: Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who served as protector, and Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, who wielded enormous influence. And it was during these early, relatively stable years of the Regency that the council made the decision to restore the Dukedom of Norfolk to John Mowbray. John became the second Duke of Norfolk, the second Mowbray to hold the title, and once again the family stood among the greatest in the land. The restoration of the dukedom was a triumph of patience, loyalty, and political skill. A vindication of everything John had worked towards since his brother's execution 20 years earlier. He had rebuilt what Thomas's recklessness had destroyed, and he had done it without raising a single sword against the crown. John Mowbray, 2nd Duke of Norfolk, died on the 19th of October 1432 at Epworth, the same manor house where Mowbrays had been born, had lived, and had died for more than 2 centuries. He was approximately 40 years old, and he was buried nearby in the Carthusian Priory at Low Melwood, which his father, the 1st Duke, had founded during his brief and tumultuous life. It was a fitting resting place, a quiet, contemplative house of prayer built by a man who had died in exile, now sheltering the remains of the son who had patiently restored everything his father had lost. John left behind one son, another John, who was just 17 years old. The young man inherited the dukedom and stepped into a world that was about to tear itself apart in the bloodiest civil war England had ever known. John Mowbray, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, was born on the 12th of September 1415 at Epworth, Lincolnshire, the ancestral manor that had been the heart of the Mowbray estates for generations. His birth coincided almost exactly with one of the defining moments of English history. The Battle of Agincourt was fought just 6 weeks later, on the 25th of October, and the England into which the young John was born was a kingdom intoxicated by military glory, flushed with the seemingly unstoppable success of Henry IV's campaigns in France. But that glory would not last. Henry V died in 1422, leaving the crown to his infant son, Henry VI. And Henry VI, gentle, pious, well-meaning, and utterly unsuited to the brutal demands of medieval kingship, would preside over the collapse of everything his father had built. The young John Mowbray was married very early, as was common among the children of the great nobility. By 1424, while both he and his bride were still children, John was married to Eleanor Bourchier, the daughter of William Bourchier, Count of Eu, and Anne of Gloucester, who was a granddaughter of King Edward III. A papal dispensation allowing them to remain married was dated March 1434, suggesting that the match had been arranged when they were so young that the Church's rules on consanguinity had to be formally addressed. When his father died in 1432, the 17-year-old John inherited the full weight of the Mowbray legacy. The Dukedom of Norfolk, the Earldom of Nottingham, the ancient barony of Mowbray, and the great hereditary office of Earl Marshal. He also inherited a position at the very centre of the English political world, a position that was becoming increasingly dangerous with every passing year. The 1440s and 1450s were a period of escalating crisis. Henry II's government lost virtually all of England's French territories, the conquests that Henry V had won at such cost. And the king's inability to maintain order at home led to the rise of powerful noble factions that competed for control of the crown. The king's closest advisers, particularly William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, and Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, were deeply unpopular, and their dominance of the royal council fueled resentment among lords who felt excluded from power and patronage. The Duke of Norfolk navigated these turbulent waters with a combination of caution and calculation. Through the Neville marriage, the Mowbrays were connected to the Yorkist faction, the grouping of lords who rallied around Richard, Duke of York, and his claim to a share of royal authority. But the Mowbrays also held their titles from the Lancastrian crown, and too open an embrace of the Yorkist cause might bring down the kind of royal wrath that had destroyed their family before. By the late 1450s, however, the time for caution was over. Open warfare had erupted between the Lancastrian forces of King Henry VI and Queen Margaret of Anjou, and the Yorkist forces of Richard, Duke of York. The First Battle of St. Albans in 1455 was the opening shot, and the conflict, which would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses, would rage intermittently for the next 3 decades, consuming the lives of kings, princes, and entire noble families. The third Duke of Norfolk committed himself to the Yorkist cause. His family ties made this the natural choice. His aunt by marriage, Cecily Neville, was the wife of Richard, Duke of York, and the mother of the Yorkist heirs. When the call came to march, the Duke of Norfolk gathered his retainers and rode north. In March 1461, the two armies, Lancastrian and Yorkist, converged on a bleak, wind-swept plateau in the North Riding of Yorkshire, between the villages of Towton and Saxton. What followed on the 29th of March, Palm Sunday, a day that should have been dedicated to prayer and peace, was the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. The numbers involved were staggering. The Lancastrian army may have numbered as many as 30,000 men. The Yorkist army was of similar size. Together, they represented a significant fraction of the entire fighting population of England, and the stakes could not have been higher. The loser would not merely suffer defeat, but annihilation. There would be no quarter, no mercy, no negotiation. This was a fight to the finish. The battle was fought in the teeth of a blinding snowstorm. The wind drove the snow horizontally across the field, and it was so thick that the combatants could barely see each other. The Yorkists, commanded by the young Edward, Earl of March, who was fighting for the throne that his father, Richard of York, had been killed trying to claim just 3 months earlier, used the wind to their advantage. Their archers fired with the wind at their backs, sending flights of arrows deep into the Lancastrian ranks, while the Lancastrian archers, shooting into the wind, saw their arrows fall short. But the Lancastrians held firm. The fighting degenerated into a savage, hand-to-hand melee that lasted for hours. Some accounts say as long as 10 hours. Men fought with swords, axes, maces, and billhooks, slipping and sliding on frozen ground that quickly became slick with blood. The chronicles speak of streams running red, of bodies piled so high that they formed barriers across the field, of wounded men trampled beneath the feet of their own comrades. One chronicler wrote that the dead lay so thick that a man could walk across the battlefield without ever touching the ground. For most of the day, the outcome was in doubt. The Lancastrian line, despite heavy casualties, refused to break. The fighting swayed back and forth across the plateau, and there were moments when it seemed that the Yorkist cause might be lost. And then the Duke of Norfolk arrived. John Mowbray and his contingent, which included his kinsman John Howard, had been delayed, possibly by the weather, possibly by difficulties in mustering their forces. They reached the battlefield late in the day, when both armies were exhausted and the fighting had reached a desperate intensity. The Duke's fresh troops struck the Lancastrian flank with devastating force. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The Lancastrian line, which had been holding stubbornly all day, finally shattered. What followed was not a retreat, but a rout. A panicked, headlong flight across the frozen fields that turned into a systematic massacre. The Yorkists pursued the fleeing Lancastrians for miles, cutting down men as they ran, driving them into the swollen waters of the River Cock, where hundreds drowned in the icy current. The death toll at Towton has been estimated at anywhere from 20 to 30,000 men, a figure that, if accurate, would make it one of the bloodiest single days of combat in the entire history of the British Isles. Towton was a Yorkist triumph, and it put Edward, Earl of March, on the English throne as King Edward IV. The Duke of Norfolk had helped make a king. His late arrival had turned the tide of the battle, and his family's commitment to the Yorkist cause was sealed in the blood of Palm Sunday. The aftermath of Towton was almost as significant as the battle itself. The Lancastrian court fled northward. Henry VI, Queen Margaret, and their young son Prince Edward escaped into Scotland, where they would spend years as exiles, plotting and scheming to reclaim the throne. The Lancastrian lords who had survived the battle scattered, some to Scotland, some to France, some to the remote castles of Northumberland, where they held out against Yorkist siege forces for years. The north of England, which had been the heartland of Lancastrian support, was pacified by a combination of military force and political concession, and the new Yorkist regime settled into power with the kind of cautious optimism that always accompanies the aftermath of a decisive military victory. For the Duke of Norfolk, Towton should have been the beginning of a new era of power and influence. He had backed the winning side, he had arrived at the crucial moment, and he was now one of the most important supporters of the new king. Edward IV rewarded his loyal lords generously, and the Mowbrays could reasonably have expected to enjoy the fruits of their commitment for decades to come. But the Duke did not live long to enjoy the fruits of victory. John Mowbray, 3rd Duke of Norfolk, died on the 6th of November, 1461, barely 7 months after Towton. He was 46 years old. The precise cause of his death is not recorded, but the physical toll of the Towton campaign, the forced march through winter weather, the hours of brutal hand-to-hand fighting, the exhaustion and trauma of medieval warfare, may well have contributed. He was buried at Thetford Priory in Norfolk, far from the Yorkshire hills where his ancestors had first made their name. His son succeeded him, and it would be this son, the 4th and final Mowbray Duke of Norfolk, who would bring the dynasty's story to its tragic and extraordinary conclusion. John de Mowbray, 4th Duke of Norfolk, was born on the 18th of October 1424, and he was just 17 when he inherited the dukedom in 1461. He quickly established himself as one of the dominant figures in East Anglia, a region where the Mowbray name now carried the weight of centuries. The 4th Duke lived like a prince. He held court at the great castle of Framlingham in Suffolk, one of the finest medieval fortresses in England, with its curtain walls and 13 towers rising above the mere and the surrounding parkland. He also maintained residences at Epworth in Lincolnshire, at his London house, and at various other properties across his extensive estates. He commanded the loyalty of hundreds of retainers, tenants, and dependents across Norfolk, Suffolk, and beyond. Men who wore the Mowbray livery served at the Mowbray table and followed the Mowbray banner when the Duke required their military service. He was invested as a Knight of the Garter in 1472, one of the highest honours the Crown could bestow, reserved for the most distinguished soldiers and the most important lords in the kingdom. He exercised the hereditary office of Earl Marshal, with an authority that left no one in the eastern counties in any doubt about his status. When he rode through Norfolk and Suffolk with his retinue, the roads cleared before him. When he held his courts, the local gentry attended with the kind of deference that was usually reserved for royalty. The Mowbray name in East Anglia was very nearly as powerful as the king's, but the 4th Duke's character had a harder edge as well. He was a man who expected to get what he wanted, who took offence easily, and who was willing to use force when persuasion failed. This combination of wealth, power, and a willingness to intimidate would lead him into the most infamous episode of his career. A conflict that would be remembered not because of its political significance, but because of the extraordinary letters that documented it. But the 4th Duke's reign was also marked by a bitter dispute that has become one of the most famous conflicts in English social history: the struggle with the Paston family over Caister Castle. Caister Castle was a magnificent fortified house near Great Yarmouth in Norfolk, built between 1432 and 1446 by Sir John Fastolf, a wealthy and decorated soldier who had served with distinction in the 100 Years' War, and invested his fortune in one of the most impressive private residences in England. The castle featured a 90-foot tower, a moat, and luxurious living quarters that reflected Fastolf's wealth and ambition. When Fastolf died in 1459, he left Caister to his lawyer and adviser, John Paston, in a verbal will that was immediately and fiercely contested. The Duke of Norfolk wanted Caister. His legal claim was weak, but he had something that the Pastons lacked: military power. When the courts failed to deliver the castle into his hands, the Duke decided to take it by force. In August 1469, the Duke moved on Caister Castle with a substantial armed force. The timing was calculated. England was in turmoil, with the Earl of Warwick's forces having just defeated King Edward IV's army at Edgecote, and the king himself was a prisoner. In the chaos, local lords across the country were settling old scores and seizing disputed properties, and the Duke of Norfolk was no exception. The siege that followed is documented in extraordinary detail by the Paston letters, the remarkable collection of private correspondence that the Paston family left behind. These letters, which are among the earliest surviving archives of private correspondence in the English language, provide a vivid, intimate, and often heartbreaking account of the siege from the defenders' perspective. John Paston the Younger, who was commanding the defence of Caister, wrote to his brother that the Duke had brought 3,000 men. Historians believe the actual number was probably closer to 300, but even so, it was an overwhelming force against a garrison of approximately 30 defenders. The Duke brought artillery, including cannons from the port of Lynn, and both sides had firearms. The siege of Caister is one of the early instances of gunpowder weapons being used in a private English conflict. The siege lasted several weeks. Men on both sides were killed by gunshot, including Daubonnet, a long-serving Paston retainer whose death was mourned by the defenders. Margaret Paston, the family matriarch, wrote anguished letters to her sons begging for reinforcements and pleading for help from the king or from any lord who might intervene. Her letters are among the most moving documents of the entire medieval period. The voice of a mother watching helplessly as her family's world crumbles around them. In the end, the defenders surrendered. Under pressure from the church, the Duke granted them safe conduct. They were allowed to leave with their lives, and he took possession of Caister Castle. He held it for the next 7 years, adding it to his already formidable collection of East Anglian properties. But time was not on the Duke's side. Throughout his 30s, John Mowbray complained of ill health in letters to his kinsman John Howard. The nature of his illness is a mystery. The sources tell us only that he was unwell and that he felt it keenly, unusual for a man of his age and status. On the 14th of January, 1476, the 4th Duke of Norfolk died suddenly at Framlingham Castle. He was 31 years old. He had apparently been in good health the day before, and the abruptness of his death gave rise to rumours of poisoning, rumours that have never been confirmed or denied. Within a single day of the Duke's death, the Paston family retook Caister Castle. The siege, the bloodshed, the years of legal wrangling. All of it had been rendered meaningless by the Duke's sudden end. But the Duke's death created a crisis far greater than the ownership of any castle. John Mowbray, 4th Duke of Norfolk, had left behind only one child, a daughter barely 3 years old. Her name was Anne, and she was now the sole heiress to one of the greatest fortunes in England. She was also the last of the Mowbrays, the final link in a chain that stretched back nearly 4 centuries to a Norman boy named Roger, who had taken a new surname and ridden out to fight at the Battle of the Standard. Anne de Mowbray was born on the 10th of December, 1472, at Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, the great stone fortress that had been the seat of Mowbray power in East Anglia for generations. The castle's massive walls, its towers and battlements, its inner and outer baileys, all of it spoke of centuries of wealth, influence, and martial power. And now all of it, along with estates scattered across a dozen counties, belonged to a baby girl. Her mother was Elizabeth Talbot, the daughter of John Talbot, the famous first Earl of Shrewsbury, who had been one of the most celebrated and feared English commanders of the 100 Years' War. Her father, the 4th Duke of Norfolk, had doted on her. She was his only surviving child, the last hope of a bloodline that had endured since the time of the Crusades, and the bearer of a name that had been great in England since before the memory of any living person. When the Duke died in January 1476, little Anne became, at the age of 3, one of the most consequential people in the entire kingdom. She was the 8th Countess of Norfolk in her own right. She was the heiress to the Mowbray estates, vast tracts of land in Norfolk, Suffolk, Yorkshire, Lincolnshire, Sussex, and beyond. She held the remnants of the Brotherton inheritance that had eluded her ancestors for so long. In a world where land was the foundation of all power, wealth, and influence, Anne Mowbray was one of the most important and most vulnerable individuals in England. Under the normal operation of feudal law, the Crown would have sold the wardship of such a wealthy heiress to the highest bidder. The purchaser of the wardship would have controlled Anne's estates during her minority, collecting the income from her lands and arranging her marriage to suit his own interests. It was a system that treated children as commodities, their value measured in acres and annual rents. But King Edward IV was not a man to let such a prize slip through his fingers. Edward was a shrewd and calculating monarch, and he immediately recognized the opportunity that Anne Mowbray's orphaned state presented. He seized the wardship for himself and began planning a marriage that would bind the vast Mowbray fortune permanently to the royal house of York. Edward's plan was both simple and breathtakingly ambitious. He would marry Anne to his younger son, Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the second in line to the English throne. Prince Richard was 4 years old. Anne was 5. The marriage would make Richard one of the richest men in England, controlling estates that would give him an independent power base, rivaling that of any other lord in the kingdom. The wedding took place on the 15th of January, 1478, at St. Stephen's Chapel in the Palace of Westminster, one of the most beautiful and sacred spaces in medieval London. The chapel was lavishly decorated for the occasion, hung with tapestries and cloth of gold, filled with the light of hundreds of candles. The King and Queen, Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, presided over the ceremony in full royal splendour. The great lords and ladies of the realm were in attendance. Musicians played from the galleries. Heralds in their tabards announced the titles of the bride and groom in voices that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. And at the centre of all this magnificence stood 2 tiny children, too young to understand the words being spoken over their heads, too small to comprehend the immense political forces that had brought them to this moment. Anne Mowbray, 5 years old, walked to the altar in a miniature gown, her small hand guided by the hand of an adult attendant. Prince Richard, 4 years old, stood beside her, fidgeting and wide-eyed, overwhelmed by the noise and colour and solemnity of the occasion. The ceremony was real. The marriage was binding. The political stakes were enormous. But the 2 human beings at the heart of it were children. And the contrast between the grandeur of the occasion and the innocence of its participants is one of the most poignant images in the entire history of the English Middle Ages. A full week of festivities followed the wedding. There were banquets and entertainments, processions and displays of wealth that were calculated to demonstrate the power and magnificence of the Yorkist court. The celebrations concluded on the 22nd of January with a grand tournament, a jousting competition in which knights rode at each other with blunted lances for prizes of elaborately embroidered letters, which were presented by Princess Elizabeth of York, the 6-year-old sister of the groom, who would one day become the Queen of England as the wife of Henry VII Tudor. As part of the marriage settlement, Edward IV conferred the Dukedom of Norfolk on young Prince Richard in a new creation, making the 4-year-old boy the titular Duke of Norfolk. More importantly, and more controversially, the king secured an Act of Parliament that ensured that even if Anne died before Richard, her estates would remain with the crown and would not revert to the rightful Mowbray co-heirs. This was an extraordinary and deeply controversial measure. It effectively disinherited the two families who had the strongest claims to the Mowbray inheritance: the Howards, who were descended from Thomas Mowbray's daughter Margaret, and the Berkeleys, who were descended from his daughter Isabel. These families had waited patiently for generations, fully expecting that when the Mowbray male line eventually died out, they would share the inheritance between them as the rightful heirs of the first Duke's daughters. Edward III's Act of Parliament denied them their birthright, and it created a grievance that burned deep and would have consequences long after the king himself was dead. Anne Mowbray, Duchess of York and Duchess of Norfolk, lived for just 3 more years after her wedding day. She spent those years in the royal household, growing up among the children of the king and queen, living the life of a princess in all but blood. We know almost nothing about her personally. The historical record is silent on the subject of her character, her interests, her temperament, or her daily life. She is a figure defined almost entirely by the circumstances of her birth, her marriage, and her death. A child caught in the machinery of dynastic politics, valued not for who she was, but for what she represented. On the 19th of November, 1481, Anne Mowbray died at the Palace of Greenwich in London. She was 8 years old. The cause of her death is unknown. The records tell us nothing beyond the bare fact of her passing. Childhood mortality was high in the medieval period, and children of all social classes died from diseases that modern medicine would consider routine. Whatever the cause, the last of the Mowbrays was gone. Anne was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the chapel of St. Erasmus, a small chapel on the south side of the Lady Chapel that had been recently built by her mother-in-law, Queen Elizabeth Woodville. She was laid to rest in a small lead coffin, anthropomorphic in shape, moulded to follow the contours of a human body, with a Latin inscription that recorded her name, her titles, and the essential facts of her brief, strange life. Anne Mowbray was the last of her name. With her death, the Mowbray dynasty, the direct line that had endured for nearly 400 years from Roger de Mowbray's adoption of the surname in 1138 to this quiet burial in Westminster in 1481, came to an end. A family that had produced Crusaders and Magna Carta barons, earls and dukes, rebels and kingmakers, soldiers and builders of abbeys, all of it reduced to a small coffin in a small chapel, containing the remains of a child who never had the chance to grow up. But the story was not quite finished. Anne's child husband, Prince Richard, Duke of York, survived her by less than 2 years, though survived may not be the right word for what happened to him. In April 1483, King Edward IV died unexpectedly at the age of 40. His eldest son became King Edward V, and Richard, now 9 years old, was next in line to the throne. But their uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's brother and one of the most powerful men in England, moved swiftly to seize control. Gloucester intercepted the young Edward V on his way to London and lodged him in the Tower of London ostensibly for his own protection before his coronation. He then had Richard, Duke of York, Anne Mowbray's child husband, brought from the sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, where Elizabeth Woodville had taken refuge with her younger children, and placed him in the Tower, alongside his brother. On the 26th of June, 1483, Gloucester declared Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, pronounced the young princes illegitimate, and seized the throne as King Richard III. The two boys were seen playing in the Tower Gardens during the summer of 1483. Attendants reported that they were well, that they played games together, that they went through the motions of daily life within the Tower's walls. And then, Gradually, they disappeared from view. The sightings became fewer. The reports stopped, and the princes were never seen alive again. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in English history. The most widely accepted theory is that they were murdered on the orders of Richard III, who had the strongest motive and the readiest means. But other suspects have been proposed, including Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, and even the future Henry VII. And the truth may never be known with certainty. What is certain is that Anne Mowbray's child husband, the boy who had stood beside her at the altar of St. Stephen's Chapel in his miniature finery, disappeared into the Tower of London and was never seen again. With the disappearance of Prince Richard, Edward IV's controversial Act of Parliament, which had kept the Mowbray estates locked in the Crown, became irrelevant. Richard III, who needed the support of every lord he could find to shore up his precarious regime, moved quickly to right the wrong that Edward had done. He restored the Mowbray inheritance to its rightful heirs, dividing the fortune between the two families that had been disinherited by the Act of 1478. John Howard, the grandson of Margaret Mowbray, eldest daughter of the first Duke of Norfolk, received the lion's share. Richard III created Howard the first Duke of Norfolk in a new creation, and he was given the bulk of the Mowbray estates, including the great castle at Framlingham. Howard was a loyal and experienced soldier who had served the Yorkist cause for decades, and his elevation to the dukedom was both a reward for past service and a bid for future support. William Berkeley, who was descended from Isabel Mowbray, another daughter of the first Duke, received the other half of the inheritance. But John Howard's triumph was short-lived. The Wars of the Roses had one final, decisive act to play. In August 1485, Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant to the English throne with a tenuous but politically powerful pedigree, landed in Wales with a small army and marched into the heart of England. Richard III gathered his forces and rode out to meet the invader. The two armies clashed at the Battle of Bosworth Field, near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, on the 22nd of August, 1485. John Howard, the first Howard Duke of Norfolk, fought loyally for King Richard. He commanded the vanguard of the royal army, and he was killed in the fierce fighting that preceded Richard's final, desperate charge. Richard III himself was slain shortly afterward, the last English king to die in battle, and his crown, according to legend, was found beneath a hawthorn bush on the battlefield and placed upon the head of Henry Tudor, who became King Henry VII. The Howard dukedom was declared forfeit by the victorious Tudor regime. But the Howards, like the Mowbrays before them, proved to be survivors. John Howard's son Thomas was imprisoned in the Tower after Bosworth, but he was eventually released and proved his worth by winning a famous victory over the Scots at the Battle of Flodden in 1513. The dukedom was restored to him, and the Howards went on to become one of the most powerful families in Tudor England. Two women of Howard blood, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, would become queens of England as wives of Henry VIII, and the family would endure, despite periodic catastrophes, attainders, and executions, for century after century. The Duke of Norfolk title that Thomas Mowbray first held in 1397 continues to this day. Edward Fitzalan Howard, born in 1956, is the 18th Duke of Norfolk of the Howard creation and the hereditary Earl Marshal of England. The office that Margaret of Brotherton held as the only female Earl Marshal, that Thomas Mowbray exercised before his banishment, that John Mowbray performed at the coronation of Henry V. That office endures, held by the descendants of the men who inherited the Mowbray fortune 500 years ago. And there is one last chapter to tell, a chapter that no one expected. In December 1964, nearly 500 years after Anne Mowbray's death, construction workers were demolishing old buildings on a site in Stepney, in the East End of London. The The site was located on the grounds of the former church of the Abbey of St. Clare of the Minoresses, a Franciscan convent that had stood near the Tower of London for centuries before being dissolved by Henry VIII during the Reformation. The convent had been gone for more than 400 years, but its foundations remained beneath the layers of later buildings that had accumulated on the site. As the workers dug through the old foundations, their tools struck something hard beneath the earth. They had broken into a small subterranean vault, a brick-lined chamber that had been sealed for centuries. Inside the vault, resting on a stone shelf, was a tiny lead coffin. It was shaped to the contours of a human body, what archaeologists call an anthropomorphic coffin, and it was remarkably well preserved. The workers extracted the coffin from the vault and, not knowing quite what they had discovered, took it to the nearest police station, Leman Street in Stepney. From there it was transferred to Dr. Francis Celoria, the archaeological field officer of the London Museum, who began the process of identification. When the Latin inscription on the coffin was read and translated, the mystery was solved. The inscription identified the occupant as Anne Mowbray, Duchess of Norfolk, who had been married at the age of 5 to Richard, Duke of York, and who had died in 1481 at the age of 8. The discovery was a sensation. The story of the little medieval duchess, the child bride, the last of the Mowbrays, the wife of one of the princes in the Tower, captured the imagination of the press and the public. It was a story that had everything: youth, innocence, royalty, mystery, and the strange romance of a forgotten grave yielding up its secrets after nearly 5 centuries. How had Anne's coffin come to be in Stepney, 2 miles from the Westminster Abbey where she had originally been buried? The answer lay in the building projects of the Tudor kings. In 1502, King Henry VIII had begun the construction of a magnificent new Lady Chapel at the eastern end of Westminster Abbey, the chapel that bears his name today and that contains some of the finest fan vaulting in all of England. To make room for the new chapel, the old chapel of St. Erasmus, where Anne had been buried in 1481, was demolished. Anne's coffin was removed and transferred to the Church of the Minoresses, near the Tower of London, and there it had remained, undisturbed and forgotten, for more than 460 years. Through the Reformation, the Civil War, the Great Fire of London, the Blitz, until a builder's shovel broke through the earth on a cold December day in 1964. Scientific examination of Anne's remains provided valuable information about the life of a medieval aristocratic child. Her body was found to have been carefully embalmed, a practice reserved for the wealthy and the highborn, and her hair was well preserved, still lying within the coffin after nearly 5 centuries. Analysis of her remains contributed to our understanding of medieval diet, health, and burial practices, and the discovery generated enormous public interest in the Mowbray family and their place in English history. The question of what to do with Anne's remains provoked considerable debate. Some argued that she should be left in the care of the London Museum. Others felt that she should be returned to the Abbey where she had originally been buried. In the end, the Dean of Westminster gave permission for Anne Mowbray to be reburied in Westminster Abbey, in the northeast apsidal chapel of the Lady Chapel, as close as possible to the original site of her burial in the chapel of St. Erasmus that had been demolished to make way for Henry VII's grand construction. On the 31st of May 1965, a small, private ceremony was held in Westminster Abbey. Anne Mowbray's coffin was placed in the Jerusalem Chamber, one of the Abbey's most historic rooms, where it lay in state surrounded by candles and flowers. Then, attended by a small group of clergy and officials, the coffin was carried to its new resting place and laid to rest for the second time. A small memorial stone was placed to mark her grave. It reads simply, 1432, Anne 1481, daughter of John Mowbray. Duke of Norfolk, child wife of Richard, Duke of York, second son of King Edward IV, was originally buried near this place. At the top of the stone are incised 3 coats of arms: the arms of Brotherton, the impaled arms of Richard, Duke of York and Brotherton, and the arms of Mowbray. They are the heraldic shorthand for a story that spans 4 centuries. From the Norman Conquest to the Wars of the Roses, from the Holy Land to the Tower of London. The stone is modest, almost hidden. It is normally covered by a portable organ, and most visitors to Westminster Abbey walk past it without noticing. But it marks the final resting place of the last of the Mowbrays. A family that held power in England for 400 years, that fought in 2 crusades and bled at Towton, that helped seal Magna Carta and inspired Shakespeare's pen, that built abbeys in the Yorkshire hills and besieged castles in the Norfolk marshes, that married into the royal blood of England and watched their children disappear into the Tower of London. And it all ended with a little girl in a lead coffin, lost beneath London for nearly 500 years and found again by the chance strike of a builder's shovel on a cold winter's day in 1964. The Mowbray name is gone, the direct bloodline is extinct, but the title they made famous endures. The Dukedom of Norfolk, first created for Thomas Mowbray in 1397, is now held by the Howard family in its 18th creation. The Barony of Mowbray, created in 1283, remains one of the oldest peerages in England. The abbeys that Roger de Mowbray built in Yorkshire, Byland, Newburgh and others, still stand in varying states of ruin and preservation, their stones weathered by 8 centuries of English rain and wind. The Paston letters, which documented the Mowbray siege of Caister Castle, are preserved in the British Museum as one of the most precious archives of medieval English life. And in the village of Epworth, in the Isle of Axholme, the land where Mowbrays were born and buried for 200 years, lies quiet beneath the Lincolnshire sky. Tonight, as you close your eyes and let these old, soft stories settle around you like falling snow, remember that the past is never quite as distant as it seems. The stones of Byland Abbey still stand in the Yorkshire hills, just as they stood when Roger de Mowbray rode past them on his way to the Crusade. The walls of Framlingham Castle still rise above the Suffolk countryside, just as they rose above little Anne Mowbray on the day she was born. And in Westminster Abbey, beneath a small stone that most visitors never see, the last of the Mowbrays sleeps on, as she has slept for more than 500 years, quiet and still and at peace. Rest now. The story is told. The fire has burned low, and the embers are fading, and the gentle, steady weight of history will carry you softly into sleep. Good night. And if you have a moment before you drift off, a quiet like and a gentle comment about which Mowbray moment touched you most help these stories find others who might need them tonight. Good night and sleep well.